for joining us today. So I would like to introduce Dr. Lucas Hertzog, and who will be presenting on the measuring ontological insecurity in a cohort of South African adolescents living in high HIV prevalence areas. So Lucas is a sociologist based at the Adolescent Accelerators Research Hub, and he works as a junior research fellow at the UKRA GCRF Accelerating Achievement for African Adolescents Hub. And he also holds a PhD and an MSc in sociology and bachelor in social sciences from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil. And his current research, or currently he investigates how a combination of social interventions influences adolescent health in Africa, articulating social theory with quantitative research. His research also focuses on the relationship between mental health and digital transformation, exploring the emergence of a digitalized society in light of paradigms introduced by social inequality studies and theories that explore this process, looking at countries in the global south. So before I hand over to our presenter today, I would just like to say that all questions will be answered at the end of Lucas's presentation, but you can also either post your questions in the chat during his presentation, and then we will share those questions with him at the end of the presentation. And also during the Q&A section, you can also raise your hand if you have questions as well. Thank you. I will then hand over to Lucas.
Thank you, Wailin. I will just start sharing my screen here for the slides. Yes. Can you hear me well? Yes?
Yes.
Thank you. So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Wailin, for the introduction and also for chairing the session. And I also want to thank the opportunity of presenting our work in this space in the CSSR. And today we will focus, as Wailin mentioned, on exploring the alternatives on measuring ontological insecurity in a cohort of South African adolescents living in high HIV prevalence areas. The reflections I'll bring today, and also the preliminary findings, are the result of collective work in progress about the development accelerators for adolescents in sub-Saharan Africa in the scope of the Accelerate Hub. For this investigation, I was supervised by Associate Professor Ilona Tosca, and our goal today is to present our work in creating those linkages between social theory and quantitative research, and also discuss some alternatives for improving our work. So I will first give a brief background of the research project that made this discussion possible, highlighting how the quality of the data that we are working with opens several opportunities in exploring these dialogues between social theory and empirical research. Then I will take a look at the social context, its particularities, and how this relates to the relevance of our work. I will then outline our research objectives, linking with the conceptual framework used for this methodological approach. We will then conclude by presenting preliminary findings and highlighting the next steps. So the data we use for this investigation comes from the Mzanziwako cohort with adolescents aged 10 to 24 years old in the Eastern Cape province in South Africa. And the cohort is a comprehensive study that uses a questionnaire with more than 700 questions focused on understanding adolescents' mental health and well-being, exposure to violence, their personal relationships and family life, education in school, their relationship with their bodies, with special attention to sexual and reproductive health, amongst other indicators linked to, for example, economic strengthening. The baseline was collected from 2014 to 2015 with a sample of more than 1,500 adolescents with 2 follow-ups, as you can see here, represented as T2 and T3 with a high retention rates. And as you'll see later in the social demographic characteristics of the subsample used for this investigation, this cohort faces several challenges. For example, 1 in 4 cannot afford food and 70% are living with HIV. And this brings us to the relationships this particular cohort has with the broader social context. Here you see a map of the study area, the Amatal district in the Eastern Cape, indicating how these areas were segregated in the recent past. To describe these areas, I quote Professors Jeremy Seekins and Nicole Natras, who wrote that, and I quote, "Africans were removed from productive land and resettled in overcrowded, quote-unquote, native reserves, or Bantustans, as they were later called, where the productivity of land steadily declined. A supply of surplus labor was thus created by a process of forced proletarianization," and end of quote. And the repercussions of this process can be seen today in alarming numbers, such as the 400,000 adolescents in the Eastern Cape that are not in employment, education, or training, representing nearly half of the population of adolescents in the province. Also, the more than 42,000 adolescents living with HIV highlight how an exclusionary regime is embodied throughout generations. So our proposal focuses on exploring some conceptual alternatives to understand this social reality. And here, I would like to highlight the works of Anthony Giddens and Peter Berger and their developments in what we could say a theory of practices. First, Giddens' structuration theory brings a series of theses about the social agents cope with existential fragility or being psychologically instilled from early childhood to elaborate what he calls a basic security system. And from this perspective, the social agents, they elaborate the system through a psychic investment in reproducing the ordered attributes of social life. And Giddens argues that this investment responds to a need for ontological security, which is an existential drive to experience the societal world as relatively safe, reliable, predictable, and intelligible. And here it is important to remember that trust and risk are at the core of Giddens' diagnosis of late modernity. And the argument is that social order may function as an existential shield to protect social agents from the anxiety about the continuity of life events, and also enable the construction of a positive self-narrative. So this widely discussed idea of how social order functions that was first developed by our classics Emil Durkheim, Max Weber, Karl Marx, and Georg Simmel, enables Giddens to articulate that chaotic environment is not related to disorganization. And instead, in his perspective, the chaos would be the loss of the reality of things and also the loss of other people. So the sense of ontological security refers to an existential posture and a broader mind state that accompany individuals throughout their lives. The ontological references acquired during childhood are consolidated during adolescence. And here the process of routinization of positive social experience are crucial for mitigating what we call ontological insecurity. And this would be a destabilized state, the ontological insecurity, provoked by what Giddens calls critical situations, and presenting what Peter Berger refers to marginal threats. In social contexts, as it is in our research of material scarcity and also psychological adversity, this construction of the self incurs in various risks, where those marginal threats, they become materialized into routinized experiences of disrespect, violence, and abuse. And here, it is essential to highlight that the structuration theory and also the formulations about ontological security are based on, let's say, anthropological and philosophical intuitions. And these formulations invite us to extrapolate these intuitions and create some linkages between social theory and quantitative research, which of course may incur in some risks that we will try to mitigate using high quality data. And given this broad overview of our context and also the conceptual framework that will guide us, our objectives are first to identify the variables that can be used as proxies for measuring ontological security. Second, to describe the prevalence of ontological security variables across 3 time points in the data set, stratified by biological sex. And finally, we will identify and evaluate possible protective factors, which we call accelerators for ontological security amongst adolescents. In addition to the specific objectives listed here, our goal is to articulate social theory with quantitative research and also identify some conceptual elements that corroborate our variable selection. So the first step was to take a deep look at our data, identifying which variables could be used as proxies to understand how the social order can be safe, reliable, predictable, and intelligible. This led us to explore all the variables that measure mental health and violence in our data set, as you can see in this representation. On your left-hand side, we have the mental health variables measuring depression symptoms, manifest anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, positive future ideation, substance misuse, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. On your right-hand side, we have the exposure to violence variables measuring sexual, physical, and emotional abuse, community and domestic violence victimization, and youth law breaking. And here at the bottom, we have our hypothesized protective factors that we call development accelerators. And in our hub, there is a growing body of evidence about several ones listed here, such as the influence of food security and parental monitoring and positive parenting in violence reduction, as demonstrated by Lucy Kluver, William Hudger, and colleagues in a recent publication, amongst various efforts from other colleagues in identifying possible transformational solutions for adolescents. The variables selected are listed here on your left, with the corresponding scale or approach to measuring on your right. So to measure depression symptoms, we use the Children's Depression Inventory Scale. Manifest anxiety is measured using the revised Children's Manifest Anxiety Scale. We also use the PTSD and ADHD scales and a composite of 9 questions about future ideation. And also this is complemented by the Child Behavior Checklist, plus 1 question about self-reported substance misuse. The violence variables listed at the bottom were self-reported exposure to violence, either experience any abuse, as in the first variable of sexual abuse, or exposure in the past year for physical and emotional abuse. And the last variable, youth law breaking, use 4 items of the CBL, which are if the participant carries a knife or a gun for own protection, if the participant is a member of a gang, and also steal things and fight a lot in order to make other people do what they want. In summary, ontological security as an outcome is the result here of 132 variables from validated scales and also self-reported measures. Here we have listed out the hypothesized protective factors, the accelerators for ontological security. Emotional and social support grasp if the participant always had support for emotional issues, such as listening, advice, the worries they had, problems, plus 7 items of social support using the Moss scale. Extramural activities was measured by involvement in at least 1 social or community activity after school. Parental or caregiver monitoring and positive parenting or caregiving were measured using the APQ scale. Basic economic security was measured by access to 8 basic necessities. It was asked if the participant could afford at home 3 meals a day, school fees, school equipment, school uniform, to visit the doctor when was ill, and also to get the medicines, and also having clothes to keep warm and dry, toiletries to wash every day, and more than 1 pair of shoes. Economic strengthening represents if someone at home is employed and a grant is received. Accessible health care was a composite of 3 variables of accessing health care at no costs, in a walkable distance, in a safe environment. And finally, food security was measured by asking if the participant could afford meals for the entire week and have 3 meals a day. As mentioned before, in the study background, we have 3 time points using repeated measures, where participants were asked the same questions over time. Our subsample comprises of more than 1,300 adolescents aged 10 to 24 years old. And we used generalized estimating equations as data, and the protective factors were coded as consistent, meaning baseline and T2, or baseline and T2 and T3. And the approach was to use multivariable logistic regressions, considering the 12 mentioned outcomes, stratified by biological sex and controlling for age, maternal orphanhood, paternal orphanhood, HIV status, rural location, informal housing, and household size. Here in this table, we can see the social demographic characteristics using descriptive statistics for the confounding variables. Gross in the same sample are slightly older, with a high level of maternal and paternal orphanhood. And we can see that many of the participants lost their parents during the cohort. The high proportion of adolescents living with HIV is consistent across time points, as well as the ones living in rural areas, with a slight decrease of participants living in informal houses. We can also see a decrease in household size, which could be linked to the loss of parents during the research. Here we have our preliminary findings, showing a summary of multivariable associations between the hypothesized protective factors and the outcomes. At the top, we have the exposure, which is, in this case, emotional and social support. And on your left, we have the outcomes. The results are stratified by biological sex for girls and boys, just girls, and just for boys. And here the results shows the odds ratio adjusted for the social demographic characteristics mentioned in the previous slide. And we highlighted the associations with statistical significance, assuming a p-value lower than 0.05. And here the odds ratio less than 1 indicates that the odds of exposure among those who present this protective factor are lower than the odds of those who are not exposed. So in this case, who didn't receive emotional and social support. So whenever we have odds less than 1, the exposure might be a protective factor. And just a reminder here that the only exception in this case is positive future ideation, that the exposure acts as a protective factor when the odds are greater than 1. And as you can see here, emotional and social support is crucial for decreasing the odds for girls and boys in showing depression symptoms, manifest anxiety, ADHD, substance misuse, sexual and emotional abuse, and domestic violence victimization. For girls, it also reduces the odds of showing PTSD. In this slide here, we confirm the benefits of parental or caregiver monitoring in consonance with previous studies from our hub that tested for other outcomes. For the whole sample, being exposed to monitoring decreased the odds of participants showing manifest anxiety, PTSD, to misuse substances, physical and emotional abuse, and also community violence victimization. And also, as we can see here, it substantially increases the odds for boys to think positively about the future. When it comes to accessible healthcare, we also have positive results, but with fewer outcomes than the previous hypothesized protective factors for ontological security. For boys and girls, it has a positive impact on depression symptoms and youth law breaking, with a higher decrease for this outcome when looking just for boys. From this slide onwards, we have the results of hypothesized protective factors that might show different directions. We have lower odds for manifest anxiety in the whole sample, and also looking just for girls. But for PTSD and ADH for girls and boys, respectively, we will have to take a deeper look into the literature to understand how these patterns are working. For economic strengthening, which was measured by asking if someone at home was employed and a grant was received, we see some promising results in reducing sexual abuse for the whole sample and also for girls specifically, but we have a different direction when looking at physical abuse. Exposure to basic economic security might be associated here with lower odds of presenting ADHD, but greater odds for other outcomes, such as manifest anxiety, physical and emotional abuse. And again, this invites us to take a look into the literature to understand these results in consonance with other studies conducted in similar settings. And in the slide here, we have the results for positive parenting or caregiving. And with the exception of positive future ideation, where we see the greater odds for girls and boys and just for girls, we have the indication that this might not be a protective factor for these particular outcomes in our subsample. And for this particular exposure, as it was measured using a scale, perhaps we have the opportunity to take a deeper look into the associations using each one of the 6 items used to check if there's a consistency across items or they point us into a different direction. Finally, we have the preliminary findings for the association between being involved in extramural activities and the selected outcomes. We have the indication that being involved in at least one social or community after-school activity might increase risks, which is also a hypothesis that we need to verify in the literature and also take a deeper look in the sample to check if the individuals who participated in the extramural activities were enrolled in specific programs, and this might explain this tendency. Again, we have greater odds for positive future ideation, which may indicate that the exposure is a protective factor for this particular outcome. The next steps for this investigation are first to review the literature with studies from similar contexts. This might help us better understand some unexpected results. Second is to combine the 12 outcomes after this review, perhaps creating a variable to look at the big picture about ontological security. Third is to explore in social theory and also looking at our sample for the possibility of creating a scale, for example, a 5-point scale from ontological insecurity to security. Third is to follow the methodological approach formulated by our colleagues William Hudgard, Mark Orkin, and Mia Saminathan to evaluate the synergy effects of identified potential accelerators, to then conduct a sensitivity analysis of multiple outcome regression with the hypothesized accelerators, covariates, and correlated residuals, and then calculates the marginal probabilities given all the combinations of identified potential accelerators. The work presented here is a result of continuous discussion with colleagues from the Accelerate Hub. And I think all of them that were involved in several aspects of this research. Ilona for the continuous support and mentoring. Bolade, Mia, and Will for creating this environment of methodological innovation and also tutoring all early career researchers as myself in conducting the analysis. Heidi for always pushing me to think about the big picture, and Lucy especially for putting together this amazing team. And this work would also not be possible without the support of our communications team with Diane and Zara, the policy and advocacy front with Rachel and Mona, the management and the finance support from Akona, Mandy, Sally, and Becky. Also the research governance team with Raylene, Jenny, and Kristen, and all the staff involved in the Manzanziwako cohort, and in our recently created team to find accelerators through secondary data analysis, and also all in support of our funder, GCRF. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Lucas. This is such a wonderful, wonderful presentation, and great work, team, for all the great analysis that was done. So we have in the chat, we have a comment from Mark and also a question from Mark. So I think I'm just going to go straight to the question. So the panels, the accelerator, are on 1,300 odd respondents. Were they drawn on wave 1 for the, I don't know, MO? For the MO.
Let me just check here. Perhaps I think it was Mark that posed the question. Yeah. Perhaps if you could please indicate the slides with the panel. I think it's the findings, right?
Mark.
That's sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
That's correct. The successive panels were on about 1,350 boys and girls. And earlier on, you showed us that there were 3 successive waves with about 98% retention. So how does this work that we're dealing with 1,350 people in looking at, in each panel, the effect of an accelerator on the 10 or 12 outcomes?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Yeah, actually, I think your graphs, if you mean the difference between the 3 individuals that are missing here from the social demographics to the panel, right?
No, maybe what you have shown us then is a T1, T2, T3 finding using the GEE. Is that correct? And your 1,350 odd are everyone in common to the 3 way?
Yeah.
Aha, got it. So there were 1,350 survivors right through.
That's right. We had to exclude the loss to follow up.
Right. No, that's negligible. Okay, that's fantastic. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mark. I see Will's hand is up. Sorry, Will.
Thanks, Wileen, and thanks, Lucas. Really fascinating stuff. And like Mark said in the chat, just lovely to see this kind of theory applied. And I'm always struck by how kind of the MW includes so many variables that allows you to kind of explore these different theories. I just wondered, my question was related to the conceptual framework. Would you be able, Lucas, would you be able to go back to it just so that we have a reference for that?
Yeah.
So that exactly the kind of pathway diagram in, I think, 2 slides time. Yeah, exactly. So I suppose I'm just interested in understanding sort of whether or not so ontological security is defined by mental health and violence, and then you have multiple inputs that are sort of capturing this safe, reliable, predictable, and intelligible environment that adolescents are sort of in or present in. So I suppose, have you been able to sort of reflect on how your findings may speak to the relative importance of any of those kind of 4 factors, so the safe, reliable, predictable, and intelligible world that adolescents live in? Does one of them stand out as more important? Are they all present? Or do you, yeah, I just wondered whether you'd seen a pattern there.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because I think one that stands out, it's about the predictability. which is captured in the composite of variables of positive future ideation. So as we could see in the results, I think there is a trend that the exposure usually has positive effects in the predictability, which is to understand, let's say, the optimism about the future. In terms of violence, which could be related to the safety of the environment, I think we have the first three of them, the emotional and social support, and then parental monitoring and accessible healthcare. We have the same direction, looking at safety. But then for the other accelerators, we would have to unpack to understand how they are operating. But I think, just to summarize, I think the most interesting finding, I would say, it's in terms of predictability of how the societal world evolves, and what is the degree of, let's say, optimism that one lives, and in terms of the relationship with the associations with the exposure factors, the protective factors.
Thanks. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Thank you, Will.
Amazing. Thank you, Will. So Lucas, I was just wondering, so I noticed one of your next steps are to combine your 12 outcomes into one variable that encapsulates kind of like ontological security. But I was just wondering, on this slide, have you thought about also combining some of your mental health variables to have like a good mental health variable, and some of your violence variables to have like a overarching kind of like violence variable, and use that as kind of your predictor, if you will?
Yeah, this is a very good question, because I think it puts a different next step in terms of being more cautious on how to combine the variables. And I think if we look into the results of the associations, we might try to unpack and combine some of them before we jump into making and merging into just one. And yeah, I think this is a very good option. And I think it will have to go in like different directions, looking at items separately, the ones that presented some unexpected results, and also going to the other direction that we could combine the ones that make sense. And of course, as I mentioned, this needs to be backed up by the literature and also the theory that is involved. And perhaps I think the next steps I need to be very cautious in terms of how to structure this argument.
Great, that's excellent. Thank you, Lucas.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or hands? I see Mark had like the aha moment in the chat. So lovely. Thank you, Mark.
Wylene, for the moment, I periodically lose where this hand is to be found in Zoom.
Okay,
my wife shows me and it vanishes again. Just in response to your question, some of us in this community are more irresponsible data exploratory people than others, and wonder sometimes how perhaps theory is adduced from patterned data rather than the other way around, as is so thoroughly taught at Will's former college, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Now, if you were to move in that direction, as you yourself, Wylene, were daringly suggesting, a really venerable way would be to factor analyze your left hand of this panel, the mental health systems, symptoms, and the right hand panel, the variations of abuse, and see if a factor analysis put them into one or maybe two factors. Indeed, if you didn't do a factor analysis, but a principal components analysis, its purpose is to give you the best possible single dimension. And then you would see which loaded and what the single resulting factor looked like. And then you could throw that at your 12 separate outcomes and just see what you see. So as I say, that's irresponsible. It's not theory driven, but it's quite fun. And if, for example, you were wondering about mediators, it's a very good way to simplify the situation before you look for them, because then you just have your 3 variables to worry about. Well, actually 4, what have you got? I'll not try and solve that right now, but indeed you've drastically done variable reduction before you start worrying about what might mediate between all kinds of mental stress on the left, all kinds of violence on the right, and your separate mitigators at the bottom. But Wileen, don't let me tempt you down that path. It's a path of ill repute.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I think this question is quite aligned with a conversation I had with Elona a couple of weeks ago, that she mentioned that a factor analysis of the panel would be convenient, trying to unpack the variations. I think after this suggestion, I'll be knocking at your door in the following weeks to have a sense check on that. Thank you.
Oh dear, I shall be accused of seducing the youth. But if Elona did it first, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, and also to consider, I think this is quite important that you mentioned in the prevalence or either a deductive or inductive approach. And I think we must be very, let's say, as Gaston Bachelard would say, epistemological vigilant, right? To not be dancing around either to inductive or deductive approach, or perhaps at least know where we stand in terms of the types of methodology that we employ in our research. But thank you, Mark.
Chair Lady Wileen, I promise this is my last use of time, but I certainly noted, but not in a knowledgeable way, Lucas's mention of Gaston Bachelard for epistemological vigilance. What a lovely concept. I haven't read any Bachelard, but I would mention to Lucas that my late mother, Prussian-born, studied in France before the Second World War under Gaston Bachelard.
Nice.
What a small world.
Yeah, wonderful.
That was in Dijon. Now I am quiet, I promise you.
No problem. I see Ilona's hand is up. Go ahead, Ilona.
Thank you, Lucas. And I've really enjoyed learning lots about the theories that you are pulling in. And maybe in that vein, it'd be interesting to hear from you where you see this going in kind of beyond the data analysis a little bit. I know we've talked about some of these, but just now that you've had a chance to talk it through with colleagues and hear their questions, to some degree, the concept of ontological security is kind of like a duh, right? That's what with theories, that's so good when you're like, yes. Yet a lot of our 5-year plans, 2-year strategies, 3-year policy guidelines, they rarely get to grapple with some of these concepts. So what could this analysis do? I mean, how would we use it when it's like the perfect shape, in 3,500 months?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, it's about the process to establish this into policy making. I understand.
Theoretical contributions. It doesn't have to be about policy, but like how will it shift? Could it shift our thinking? What would we do?
Yeah, I think this is a very first step in these attempts to capture, as I mentioned, anthropological and philosophical intuition into a quantitative analysis. So I think the next step will be trying to follow perhaps the path that Mark and also Vailin and Will mentioned, and trying to be more careful in terms of what we are saying when we are using these concepts with these particular variables. Are there any other variables that might be useful here in this context to understand safety, reliability, predictability, and intelligibility? But I do believe that we can also make a social theory infusion into the conceptual frameworks that we use. And I mean the Sustainable Development Goals, also the INSPIRE framework. How can we relate sociological theory with those broad perspectives that are aiming at some specific goals? So yeah, I think this would be a challenge to write this up. Not just having the statistical results, but also trying to corroborate with the social theory how this operates in real life, right?
Thank you for that, Ilona. Okay. Is there any other questions? Any thoughts or comments?
Eileen, that's terrible. You tempt me to break my promise. Just as a suggestion for Lucas, arising from Ilona's question, she or you used the word, the articulation of the theory with the data, which I said at the outset, it's such a welcome thing to see attempted. And another eccentricity of mine, which tends to go with a fairly data-driven approach to generating theory, is the underlying logic. It's, as you rightly point, it's neither hypothetico-deductive. You didn't draw these as predictions to test from the theory, because you had an awful lot of empirical relationships even before deducing the theory. And conversely, you didn't induce them from the stuff because Giddens gave you the theory. You didn't have to induce it. What then is the relation? And a less favored, but nevertheless well-founded and indeed quite old approach to that relationship is abduction. Now, I'm sure you've encountered it, but I think it's actually what's at stake here. It's basically saying that if this data is sound, that theory is supported by it, that both would be true, but it's not a relationship of one arising from the other or being used to test the other. And it started, I believe, with Charles Peirce, but of course it has lots of modern defenders. And that might let you philosophize the relationship in the one direction, even as in the other direction, you're attempting to see what policy implications might follow. So, Wileen, my apologies. I make promises only to break them.
Yeah, I think you raised a very important point, Mark, which is also the idea that our data might also provoke changes into social theory. And I think this is the beauty of conducting quantitative research in light of social theory. Because if we start to unpack this and trying to to understand how the combination of variables work. We might even say that some formulations might be, let's say, refined. And of course, this concept is being taken from different perspectives. Just come to my mind that some people in social anthropology are working with this concept through the idea of ontological turn. After the cultural, let's say, the cultural developments in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the idea of dealing with ontologies rather than cultures. So I think it's just about us to shake social theory with some data. And I think this is quite important.
Great. Thank you, Lucas. So I was just wondering if there's any last questions, any last comments for Lucas? Okay. Seems like there's no other questions. Yeah, I agree, Ilona. Very cool slide.
Thank you.
Lovely. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today, and such a lovely, wonderful presentation by Lucas as well, with beautiful slides. So yeah, so I think we will then end our session here today. And yeah, so as I said, a very great, big thanks to everybody who joined today. And thank you for all the questions as well, for Lucas. So yeah, so I think I will hand it over. Sorry, I don't know if I have to hand it over to Sarah or Diana.
All good. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Looking forward